Radionics has a long, but I must say difficult history. It all started with Dr. Albert Abrams, and he was the pioneer of what later became radionics or radionics because they thought they were using radio waves at one point. So Albert Abrams was a medical doctor. He trained to become a medical doctor, but he graduated too soon because he was a brilliant young man and graduated from medical school before he was legally able to practice. So he went to Germany where he got his second medical degree and then came back to America and started his practice. And one day he discovered a strange thing. In that time, it was common to use a method called percussion on the abdomen to see if there were any sore spots to help diagnose if there was a problem in the stomach or the spleen or different parts of the abdomen. And one day he was tapping on one of his clients and he heard this hollow thud sound, which was very strange. And so he got to thinking about it, and he had the patient come back the next day, and the thud sound was gone. This hollow sound was gone. So he got to thinking about it more and more, what was different? And he realized at one point, he got an intuitive flash perhaps, that the patient was facing west. So he had the patient come back again, and when they faced west, the hollow sound appeared. And when he would change directions into any other direction, the hollow sound would go away. And so he started experimenting on all of his different patients, and he found that there was a pattern of which diseases a person had, where that hollow sound in the abdomen would be. And so he actually then mapped that and was able to percuss on different parts of the abdomen and do a very accurate diagnosis with this. He started teaching this to people, and I heard that even in an auditorium where he was teaching, they could hear this hollow thud sound in the entire auditorium without microphone or PA system. So this was kind of a map of different places on the abdomen where he would tap, and one place would be like for diabetes, and one would be for cancer, and one would be for emphysema. And I don't know exactly which one was which, but he developed a specific map for these diseases. The difficult part was that several diseases would show up in the same place. The abdomen is really quite small, so there weren't a lot of choices, and there were a lot of different diseases. So he was wondering if there was some way he could filter out these different frequencies. He thought this was a type of a frequency because it only happened when the patient would stand west, so he thought it was some kind of electromagnetic frequency that he was picking up, or resonant frequency. And so also he was having difficulty on some patients. They were too ill to tap on their abdomen. If they had like stomach cancer, for example, it was too painful. So he got this idea, if this was an electrical reaction, then he should be able to put like a copper plate with a wire and another copper plate, and perhaps the ill person would stand on one copper plate and the sick person would be on the other copper plate, and then he could tap on the healthy person and he should get the same response. And sure enough, that worked. So it was like a surrogate testing. And then he got the idea, well, if he put a resistance box to try to filter some of the different frequencies out, perhaps these electrical, maybe it wasn't quite of a frequency was what he was thinking, but electrical charge coming through there, he might be able to filter out different diseases. And sure enough, that worked. And so he came up with a device to where he could change the different rates, or the resistance, and get a different sound for each different disease pattern or pathogen. And this worked very, very well. Another thing that he did, he came up with the use of a glass rod on the stomach, because if you rub a glass rod on your hair, for example, you can pick up little bits of paper with it, and because it picks up static electricity. So he was thinking if he could rub that on the stomach, maybe it would create some kind of charge or something on the abdomen where the hollow sound was, and that also worked. It would produce like a dragging, sticky sensation over that area. And so that worked very well for him. So he didn't always have to pound on people's stomach. This was one of his first instruments called the Pathoclast, and this was one of those resistance boxes where he could tune out certain disease frequencies and tune in other disease frequencies. And then he was able to send back those frequencies, and he had very good results at getting people well from their diseases. At one point, he was thinking possibly, since this is kind of a vibrational thing, he wondered if he could use just a blood spot of the person, because some people were too sick to even come to his office. So he would put a blood spot on the copper plate and then check the surrogate tester, the healthy person, with the glass rod or tapping on their abdomen. And that worked well as well. So this was the beginning. This was the reflexophone. These were the very beginnings of what later became what we call radionics or radionics. So again, I think I mentioned in my last video that Albert Abrams had a difficult time toward the end of his life. The MA started cracking down on electromedicine as well as chiropractic and homeopathy. And they basically drove him out of business, and he basically died a ruined man, even though he had done this fabulous work. But one of his students, Ruth Drown, she was a chiropractor, and she took up his work after, well, probably during the time that he was alive, but she continued on with his work and developed even further the instrumentation. And this is one of her instruments. And now, instead of using the glass rod on the stomach of the person, she found a way to make like a rubbing plate. So this was kind of like the glass rod going over the stomach, but it has little detectors underneath of it. So you would rub on the plate and have the blood spot of the person inside the instrument, and then you could dial in the different rates or frequencies and do an analysis that way. And that worked very well too. Later she was also put in jail, and her instruments mostly destroyed in her lab and everything else. George Delaware was working with Ruth Drown, and then the Second World War broke out, and so he wasn't able to get instruments anymore from America. So he decided to start building his own instruments based on her work. Then he upped the design a little bit. This was one of his instruments. And he created a stick pad with a rubber. He used like a rubber over a magnet. And this was his rubbing plate. And so what happens is when one would rub on it and dial in the resonant frequency, the fingers would actually jump on the rubber. And I have tried this one, and it did work. It was very strange. That was the first instrument that I ever saw in my life like this, of a radionic instrument. Like I said, I think in the last film, a friend of mine was also an electronic engineer, and I have an electronic background. And so we took it apart and we were trying to figure out how it all was wired together, and it didn't make any sense to us in terms of normal electronic theory. But the instrument itself worked. I mean, everybody's had great results with Delaware instruments. Later came Galen Hieronymus in the 50s, and he continued the work. He's an American. He was a radio engineer, and he developed his own instrumentation. Also, that's the rub plate where the arrow is pointing. And what's very interesting about this is that he was able to detect the elements very, very well, the whole table of elements. So they could put one of the different elements, let's say sodium, in the cell up on the very top of the instrument there. He was able to then dial into that frequency and know that that was salt or sodium. So he was able to detect all the different elements then from dialing into the specific resonant frequency. And because of that, he was able to get a US patent on his instrument. David Tansley, now he didn't build any instruments himself. He used other people's equipment. But what he brought to radionics was working with the more esoteric aspects of metaphysics. So chakras, rays, the subtle anatomy of man. And so he really brought out the metaphysical aspects of our aura and our internal multidimensional self, and used that together with radionics. So he has several books, as you see here. They're all very well written books. Then Dr. Willard Frank, also known as Bill Lawson, he was a PhD physicist. He was into audio as well. Most of these guys came out of audio or radio. and he developed some very high-end audio equipment. But his hobby was radionics. The first one was called the Nutritron and the Vitatron. He built several instruments. This is the Digitron D, which was the first one I actually saw. This was the predecessor to the SE5. And I worked together with Bill for about over 20 years and worked very closely together. And then when he passed away, his widow basically turned everything over to me to continue his legacy. So this is the SE5, the one on the left. That was the original one that I worked with, got it in 1987, and worked with that for a long, long time, and until, of course, the SE5 Plus came out in the mid-90s. But those are still available on eBay sometimes, and people still use them. They're still very good instruments. I wrote a book about the SE5 called Regaining Wholeness Through the Subtle Dimensions, where science meets magic. And this book goes through the history, some of the things I'm talking about here, but it also goes into uses, step by step, of how to do a lot of different things with the SE5. Now it's been translated into many languages and has kind of become the Bible of radionics in a lot of ways. So this is the SE5 1000. So after Bill passed away, his widow basically turned everything over to me, and I redesigned it and got it up to a little bit more modern levels with USB connection, and now we can connect, to a laptop. And as we get into depth with this, you'll see we can even then do things via remote, meaning with the internet, that kind of remote. It always worked by remote, which we'll go through of how it works. But this is the SE5 1000, and the stick plate there is where the arrow is pointing, and it has then some scalar antennas underneath of the rub plate, and as you rub it and you hit a resonance peak, there's like a little bit of a charge, or you actually get a sticky feeling on the plate itself. The next step after the 1000 was creating balancing only instruments. So this made it easier to work on many, many different clients at the same time. Like in this example, we have 5 balancing only units with 5 computers plus the computer for the SE5 1000. And this then multiplies your ability to do many, many clients at the same time, because you can balance one person after the other in the software. But there are only so many hours in a day. So if you have 10 clients and you're trying to get them all balanced within 24 hours, some of those programs can run over 2 to 3 hours. And so then you would need more instruments. So we came up with a small unit called the balancing only instrument for the SE5, and it works together with the software. And this was the next step beyond the SE5 1000 to be able to then spread out and be able to do much more and many more clients at the same time. The next step after this was, okay, if we could find a way to connect to the internet, maybe we could build like a website where it could look for any instrument that's not being used and then start balancing the person via remote. So basically that's what we did. We created a website where you can go and upload your photograph and choose a program that you want to balance, and then push go and it'll go find a unit that's not being used. And so we built these servers, these radionic servers. This one has 10 different, basically SE5s in it, and but it's only for balancing. There's no analysis ability whatsoever, so there's no stick plate, nothing like that. It's only connected to the website. It's only for balancing. So basically you just choose a program and you can run it. Toward the end of this series, we're going to go through step by step how to use the online servers, and to where you can actually then start balancing yourself and running your own programs on yourself. So if you want to get more info on the history of radionics, this was my favorite book that I've seen on the history and the most detailed. It's called The Report on Radionics by Edward Russell.